Morning, everyone. This is Doug. I'm feeling a lot better. I'm not 100% yet, but hopefully my voice will carry over and I won't cough endlessly during this episode. Anyway, the strange Christology of Paul at odds with the Trinity as well as Unitarianism. So most Pauline people actually just take little bits and pieces of Paul out of his doctrines on Christ and his nature, and they don't compare one thing to the other, and they never see what I'm going to show you. And that's important. You need to look at the entire context of Paul's thought. Now, the very first thing you need to know about is Colossians 1:15. This is where Paul says Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature. And in Greek, that's proto, meaning first, and tokos, childbirth. So he is clearly saying that Jesus was the firstborn of creation. And you will see that even inside the Nicene Creed, it is admitted that Jesus is begotten. It'll say begotten and then not made. And they have a whole rationale that Jesus had the same substance of the Father imputed to him at some point in time after his creation. And that eternal substance made Jesus now not only a begotten being initially, but now being sharing this eternal substance from the Father. He now became eternal himself. Now that's a whole theology, right, in and of itself. But what really you have to deal with first of all is, how can a being that is time bound, meaning not in existence from eternity, how can that being be God? But Paul claims he is. Well, he never says he's God. He actually says he's just the creator of heaven and earth, which hard to imagine how you could be that if you're not God. But anyway, so this is the first thing you need to know. And why is this important? Because the Nicene Creed rejected that there is such a thing as a begotten being who cannot also simultaneously be eternal. And that was the argument of the anti-Trinitarian party, was to use Paul's words and say, hey, Paul never says you can be both eternal and non-eternal. You're begotten. And that's simply it. And Paul ends the argument. And indeed it did. There is no such thing as substance being eternal in God's being inside of him. He's a spirit, he's not a substance, and yet that substance can impart eternal nature to a being who's a finite being. So Paul was correct. Those who argued Paul refuted the Trinity were the only ones who made any sense. The other makes no sense, that there is a substance in God, which is untrue, and that then this substance of God imputed an eternal nature to the Son, and he no longer was just a son, he was also an eternal being equally with the Father. But anyway, now, the way I want to start this off is Paul imagines a nature to Jesus, meaning an eternal, a finite being nature, which should shock Trinitarians. So as I just showed you, it's shocking. And again, if you study the disputed time of the Nicene Conference of 325, this was the argument of the other side, that Paul said Jesus was a begotten being, and in fact called him the firstborn, the prototokos of creation. So you cannot avoid that if you're a Paul fan, that he was the hero of the anti-Trinitarian party. But those people, of course, were killed who didn't go along, or they're exiled, which is effectively killing them if they didn't go along with the idea that there's both eternal nature and a finite nature to Jesus. Begotten as the first created being, he's finite, but on the other hand, since he had this eternal nature imparted to him, that substance from the Father, he became eternal as well. So again, nonsense became doctrine, and then if you don't believe in it, you get exiled, and that's effectively a death sentence. So this is not a decision that was made in a theological vacuum of, oh, let's find the most true thing we possibly can. It was found under pressure by Constantine, who proved in his death that he was a pagan, as we have demonstrated at this channel. Now, what else is strange about Paul's statement? Paul's strange Christology about Jesus contradicts John 20, verse 17. So just think about this for a minute. Jesus tells, in John 20, verse 17, Jesus tells Mary Magdalene, and she's the first one he meets, according to John. And he tells her, don't touch me. I haven't returned yet to my Father and your Father, my God and your God. So her God and Father is the same God and Father of Jesus, according to Jesus. Now, that doesn't sit well with any Trinitarian because, of course, Jesus doesn't have the same Father as Mary Magdalene because he's what? He was imparted an eternal nature, according to the Nicene Creed, at some point after his creation as a being, as a prototokos son. And how can that being have the same Father as Mary Magdalene? Because if you read carefully the next verses, which we'll read next in Colossians 14:15 and through 17, is Jesus is the creator of all beings after himself. So the Father only creates Jesus and doesn't create anybody else. Then Jesus creates everything. So this verse here in John 20:17 is violative. Is violated by Paul. Let's read what Paul says. Colossians 1:15-17 KJV. Jesus is the firstborn of every creature. We just talked about that. 16. For by him, Jesus, were all things created in heaven and in earth. All things were created by him, Jesus, and for him. Verse 17. He, Jesus, is before all things, and by him all things consist. Verse 18. And he, Jesus, is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. Then all things he, Jesus, might have the preeminence. So Jesus is the firstborn of every creature, prototokos, verse 15. Then Jesus created all things, for by him, Jesus, were all things created in heaven and in earth. All things were created by him, Jesus, and for him. So it's actually said twice in reverse, so that you can't make, there's no ambiguity. Whoever wrote this was trying to make it clear. He created all things, and all things were created by him. So you cannot escape and claim there's any ambiguity. That is exactly what was the intention, but it tripped him up, because after Paul writes this, 30 years later, John, before he dies, writes these words that Jesus told Mary Magdalene, my Father, I return to my Father and your Father, my God and your God. And clearly, if Jesus is the creator of all things, he is the Father. He alone is the Father of Mary Magdalene and all the race of humanity, because God did not create humanity. God created Jesus, who wasn't, you'll see in a minute, he wasn't a human being. And well, how could he? Because human beings don't exist until Adam. And Adam means a human being. Actually, the word Adam means human being. So Jesus isn't a human being. He would have been called Adam. He was not Adam. He was the creator of Adam, and he was the creator of all life. See? So Paul has put Jesus in a specifically very narrow spot. And I'm just going to tell you real quick what that means. Only one deity in the universe that fits this, if you didn't know. And we described this in the review of the book called On the Letter E by Plutarch in the 200s, early 200s. He was a priest to the priestess of Delphi and Philippi. And so in that community of belief systems, the god Apollo was also known as Dionysius. And Dionysius is the subject of the play Bacchae. And in that play, Paul quotes from this play actually when he meets Jesus allegedly on the road. His Jesus says, you cannot kick against the pricks. And his Jesus actually quotes the meter of the play. The play is written in meter, so it rhymes. And instead of Paul quoting Jesus just saying it naturally without a plural, he adds the plural and adds the meter, and therefore Paul is quoting from the play. And this is a religious play, meaning the people of Greece treat these plays as if they are God's word in a similar way that we do, but they mean it in a theatrical sense at the same time. It's just the way they are. Anyway, so Paul is claiming Jesus is the exact same replica, where Apollo is a son of Zeus. He, Apollo, aka Dionysius, he becomes the creator of heavens and earth, and also is projected to be the destroyer of heaven and earth when that time comes necessary. So that means Paul is totally injecting into Christianity a pagan view of God, that you can have a God who isn't the creator of the only being before himself, meaning in this case Jesus. Jesus was the first prototokos. He exists, and a creator being made him. That means that God is the God. But now after Jesus is made, Jesus now has this power to be God and make all things and created all things through him. So, but it violates my father and your father. I'm returning to my father and your father, my God and your God, because Jesus would have been her God and her father if Paul was correct. But Paul is not correct. Paul is adopting pagan religion and injecting it into Christianity like a like a transfusion. Now, if anyone tries to dispute that the Arian party, the anti-Trinitarian party, relied upon Paul, then you need to deal with this. Christian scholar Wayne Grudem, concurs with what I'm saying. Quote, support for the Arian, i.e. the anti-Trinity view, was found in Colossians 1, verse 15. Wayne A. Grudem, Systematic Theology and Introduction to Biblical Doctrine. It was honored in 1994 at 243. So there's no doubt that the anti-Trinitarian view came from Paul's writings, of all things. Now, based on this, Arius and his allies, Arius was a priest, and that's where the word Arian comes from. It doesn't have anything to do with Hitlerian doctrine or anything like that. The name of the priest was Arius, and his doctrine of being anti-Trinitarian, based on Paul, was called Arianism. Based on this, Arius and his allies held precisely as Paul teaches in Colossians 1, verses 15 to 16, that, quote, Christ is a creature of the Father, though existing before the world, end of quote, which interpretation was revived by, quote, the Socinians. This is in J.P. Lang, Commentary on the Holy Scriptures, Scrivener, 1871, Volume 3 at 447. So just so you know, the Roman Catholic Church had this habit of, we're not going to talk about Paul directly. We're just going to categorize his doctrine in a way that we can call it heretical without saying Paul's heretical. So they created a label called Socinians, meaning Socinius had a doctrine that relied upon Paul, reviving Arianism, anti-Trinitarianism, Arianism. And so that's how they try to distance the issue from Paul, but it's clearly still Paul. Now, I want to look at this for a minute here. Jewish commentator Schoenfeld says this, quote, Paul's Christ is not God. He is God's first creation. So Schoenfeld is being fair, even though he's Jewish, telling us your own guy says Jesus was the prototokos, the firstborn of creation. And then he goes on, and there is no room for the Trinitarian formula of the Athanasian Creed. So you have to know that the Athanasian Creed is supposedly because Athanasius wrote it, which likely he didn't, but because it came so many hundred years after his death, but that's another thing. Catholicism never really cares about anything not really being historically dated correctly. It's just they can label things hundreds of years later as if it had existed previously. But anyway, Athanasius didn't write what he's attributed to having said. The Nicene Creed literally was the Nicene Creed. And then later, many hundreds of years later, they started calling things that are similar or expounding on it as Athanasian Creed. Anyway, and then it goes on. There is no room for the Trinitarian formula, so Schoenfeld points out, of the Athanasian Creed, nor for its doctrine that the Son was, quote, not made, nor created, but begotten. In other words, you have inside the Nicene Creed, it'll say, and inside the Athanasian Creed, it'll also say that Jesus was not made nor created. Just simply make stuff up, completely contrary to what Paul says. So if you claim Paul is your guy, how can you do these things? But that's what Schoenfeld is saying. He's sticking it in our eye and saying, you can't do what you're doing and claim you follow Paul. And he's right. Now, the next thing is most Trinitarians don't even understand that Trinity was not adopted at Nicaea. That was the deity of Christ in 325, Council of Nicaea. No decision was made about the Holy Spirit being a God as well. The reason that this had to be addressed or was addressed in 381 AD, is there a Trinity, including the Holy Spirit, was deliberately to make it even more difficult for people to believe there's one God. If we've added a new third God, so the reasoning of Gregory of Nyssa was, well, then that's going to just make it even harder for them to believe if there's three gods and the church is telling everybody there's three gods and one Godhead, well, now that's going to make it a lot harder for people to believe in one God. And that was its purpose. And we've gone through all that. But anyway, here it is. Gregory of Nyssa wrote a book called The Great Catechism, where he explains why the myth of monotheism has to be destroyed. And the way we're going to do that is by adopting a third God. It's all there. It's all laid out. It's shameless. Disgusting stuff. But anyway, And even Philip Schaff tells you what I just said. That's what it was. The point of it was to prove the myth of monotheism. That was the whole purpose of the Conference of Constantinople in 381 AD that first adopted the Trinity of God, three gods in one. Anyway, when the Trinity was announced in 381 AD, the founder, Gregory of Nyssa, simply rejected Paul's statements. Quote, to believe that the Son is a created being, what did Paul call him? The prototokos, is to make man's salvation dependent on something which is imperfect and needs itself redemption. End of quote. St. Gregory of Nyssa, the Catechetical Oration of Gregory of Nyssa, 1903 at XXXXVI. So, there you have it. Paul's wrong. Do you believe him? Well, there is some truth to the question. If man's salvation depended on something which is imperfect and needs redemption, yes, he'd be completely right. But Christ did something unusual. He obeyed the law. And just like Noah was perfect in his generation, so was Jesus perfect in his generation. He never sinned. And as long as he did that, he could be the atoning Messiah. I believe the suffering servant is a figure that is atoning. And so there's that example right there in Isaiah 53, if you want to see what that's all about. But this reasoning is very evil and diabolical. Wouldn't you agree? So it's just, but this tells you that people are willing in the Roman Catholic Church to reject Paul's statements when it didn't fit their theology. And now they have to have a third God. And if they can't do that, they feel they're going to be a failure. So they have to have three gods in order to defeat the myth of monotheism, as Gregory of Nyssa put it. Then, another note, Pope Alexander of Alexandria tried to reconcile Paul to the deity of Jesus by saying the Son exists, quote, independently of God the Father, continually begotten in a state of unbegottenness. You really have to wrap your head around that. But anyway, let me give you the full cite. Martin Werner, Formation of Christian Dogma, Harper, 1957 to 223. I actually read that out of the book, and I'm like, how puzzling can people write like this stuff? But that's what the Pope Alexander of Alexandria did to try to make Paul match that Jesus is God, because Jesus could exist in a state of unbegottenness. I'm going to beget you in a state of unbegottenness. Therefore, because I've declared the begottenness I've done is an unbegottenness, you are no longer begotten. Literally, this is what's called what? It's right out of 1984. How many fingers am I holding up? Is it 4 or is it 5? And if I make you blur your eyes and use enough pain and inflict enough harm, which was the Catholic Church's sole strategy to get people to believe all this stuff, was pain and expropriation and denial of inheritance and all these punishments if you wouldn't go along with the Trinity. I'm serious, ladies and gentlemen. This is unbelievable stuff. The Shema, that God is one, was banned. It actually be said in the Jewish synagogues of the Justinian Empire beginning in the 500s. This is how evil these people had become. They didn't care. God being one is the last thing on earth they want to deal with. God is three beings, multiple beings, so that we can claim there is no, the pagan religions are not wrong. There was more than one God, and that is an important part of what's going on in the behind the scenes, because Constantine wanted to be remembered as God of the sun and the sky, and we have a whole thing about that. Paul at the same time says after God created Jesus, that Jesus then created everything else. That's Colossians 1:16-17. This should shock both Trinitarians and Unitarians. If everyone assumed Paul was correct in saying Jesus was non-eternal in the first place, how could a created being himself be the creator? How could he be God? A puzzle, to say the least. And again, I want to read it to you so you can read it and blazon this in your head. For by him, Jesus, were all things created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. Forget about God, Yahweh. He's an afterthought. And you've got to realize Paul denigrated God, Yahweh, numerous times. He even said he's dead. If you don't believe me, go take a look at Romans 7. He talks about the Jewish people are married to their husband, but their husband has died, and that freed them from the law of them, and now they're free to marry another, which is Jesus. Go do the math. Somebody had to be eliminated in order for Jesus to marry someone other, for the people of Israel to marry someone other than the Father, to be married to Yahweh. He had to die. That's in Romans 7 if you don't know where it is. I want to expose you to two verses that are very, very important for Christians to measure whether Paul is speaking at all consistent with God's word. He isn't. 1 John 4, verse 3 and 2 John, verse 7. And here's the message basically is Paul, anybody who says that Jesus did not come in human flesh, that he had some sort of divine flesh, could suffer no pain, any of these kind of claims, this is the message of Antichrist. So let's listen to this. 1 John verse 4, 3. And every spirit that confesses not that Christ is come in the flesh, in sarx, and sarx is the word for human flesh, is not of God. And this is the spirit of Antichrist, whereof you have heard that it should come, and even now already is in the world. So the Antichrist wants to take away and deprive Jesus of his true humanity and claim he isn't really human. He just looks human. He might seem like he's a human being, but he's not. He is never subject to any pain or suffering at all. 2 John verse 7. For many deceivers are entered into the world who confess not that Jesus Christ has come in sarx, in human flesh. This is a deceiver and an antichrist. So guess who's going to say that Jesus didn't have human flesh and he just appeared to be a human being but wasn't truly human? Who do you think that's going to be? All right, so let's not be shocked when we find out the answer. Paul, in Philippians 2, verse 6 to 7, says it twice that Jesus was not a true human being. Paul's remark that Jesus was not truly human, but only appeared to be human, precisely fits the message of the Antichrist according to Apostle John. So let's read this passage. We're going to read it in Mounce's reverse interlinear, so you can't even argue there's a debate about it. Philippians 2, verse 6 to 7. Who, although he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped. Okay, so is he a human being? No, but at the same time, is he going to grasp onto God being God? Or is he going to be in this limbo state where he's not human and he's not God, fully God? He's given up his equality. Let's see. Although he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant, being born, form, by the way, morphe, being born in the likeness, homomoia, which doesn't mean he looks like a human being, the likeness of man, and Paul's going to repeat this again, so there's no question. And being found in appearance, a schema, as a man. So he looks like a man, he appears to be a man, but he really isn't. He's really God. And he's just declined having the equality that he could otherwise have asserted. He's just going to look like a human being, but he isn't really a human being either. So Jesus on earth was still not himself a true human, but only was made in the likeness of men, or the second time Paul says it, found in the appearance as a man. Therefore, there's no doubt Paul's message is identical to Antichrist. You go, oh my gosh, that's outrageous. I'm not putting words in Paul's mouth. He's putting the words in his own mouth in clear, hey, let's go back. Is there any doubt that Jesus Christ has to come in the flesh, and if anyone claims he didn't come in human flesh, he's the spirit of Antichrist? Oh yeah, that's what John says twice. And Paul just as strongly twice says Jesus did not come in human flesh. He just looked like he was. I can't make this stuff up, ladies and gentlemen. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's the problem. You want to poke your eyes out and say, I didn't see it. I see it. I didn't hear it. I don't have to pay attention to this guy. But look, I'm showing you reverse Mounce interlinear. What more normative can you get? He's an NIV translator, an ESV translator, and he can't change the words on the page. I'm sure he wishes he could. So Apostle John has told us, many deceivers who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in human flesh have gone out into the world. Any such person is a deceiver and the Antichrist. And if you ask me, this is the only one person you can absolutely prove it from, except one more, and that's Marcion, which we'll get into in a second. Okay, so I just want to introduce you to how this is abstractly dealt with by Christianity in general, because obviously Paul is violating the message, or embodies the message of Antichrist. So how are they going to get away from that? How are they going to make you unsee it? By never showing it to you, by using other labels or names. And one of those names is Docetism. So Docetism is based on a Greek word which means appearance, something that just appears to be from Christ, okay, or appears to be human or not. So that's how they did it. They abstractly deal with it. They don't mention Paul, and then just simply say that's what's wrong. And then they look at those people who are agreed, other than Paul, to be heretics. Paul's can't possibly be a heretic, even though he says the same thing that the false teachers of Marcion and others say. But we're just going to ignore Paul and just hope that people don't ever read anything he says. Anyway, so here is a summary in Wikipedia. The history of Christianity, Docetism, from the Koine Greek word dokein, and you can just see it here, dokein, to seem, dokesis, apparition, phantom. So anything that appears to be human being is docetic. Okay, is the heterodox doctrine that the phenomenon of Jesus, his historical and bodily existence, and above all, the human form of Jesus was mere semblance without any true reality. Sorry if you don't see this, my friends, but that's what Paul said. And they're not telling you in this article that it's the message of Antichrist. They just leave that out, by the way. So it's just like, broadly, it is taken as the belief that Jesus only seemed to be human and that his human form was an illusion. And see, now they're trying to make it sound like a complete illusion. But you know what? That's what Paul is saying. It just appears to be this way, but it really isn't. It's not, it's God underneath the whole thing. And he's just not claiming the quality of God. And he is just, he appears just to be a human being, even though he's not a human being either. Here's a little synopsis that comes from Christianity.com. Docetism is a Christian heresy that states that Jesus had an apparent body, but not a real one. The word comes from the Greek word dokesis, which means to seem. Docetism believed that Jesus was immune to the human experience of birth, hunger, thirst, suffering, death, fatigue, and more. Now that's an exaggeration. Okay, that's they're trying to distance the whole issue because, of course, would Paul agree that Jesus ate? We don't know if he thought that Jesus could eat, truly eat, or really have hunger. But the fact is, we know that the Jesus of the 12 is completely normative, meaning he's a human being. He does all these, hunger, thirst, suffering, death, fatigue, and all that. But Paul never says these things. He's talking about a Jesus he only knows in the third heaven and doesn't know a Jesus who's suffering physical limitations or is eating or anything like that. So you have to be wary of when they do these type of things where they try to get you to mix you up. But anyway, let's continue. The Creed of Jesus. This is interesting. This is a sermon preached for Crescent Springs Presbyterian Church for the 7th Sunday after Pentecost in 2021. And they're going to talk about a heretic named Marcion. Marcion believed that Paul was the only true apostle. The other 12 were just losers who are going to serve in Hades with Yahweh forever. And the people of Israel will be in Hades, basically the land of the dead, never experiencing or enjoying heaven, which belongs only to not the God Yahweh, but the God the Father. So you now have multiple gods already. See what's going on with Marcion, and Jesus is in heaven with the Father God, and they have no judgment. They forgive everything. Everybody who just calls on their name is automatically saved by faith alone. Totally faith alone doctrine system. And that's it. It's very simple. And all those people who believe there's any kind of standards or requirements have to live with the punishment of that, which is you're going to be in Hades, basically hell, but it won't be punishing in that sense, brimstone and fire. But you will be in, this land of the dead with God Yahweh forever. That's their whole system in a nutshell. Now let's listen to Marcion's teaching. Marcion was joined by Gnostics. That's people who believe you're saved by gnosis, like, for example, that Jesus died, buried, and resurrected. That is a gnosis religion, if you didn't know it. It's just believing in knowledge. It doesn't prove anything moral about you. It makes you better or worse than anyone else. You just believe in some facts. Just as if I told you, would you believe in Lazarus' death and resurrection? Would you believe in that? Can you believe in that? If I told you can go to heaven if you believe in that? Sure, I'm going to believe in that. Why not? That's exactly why gnosis was ridiculed in the 200s in the early church. Gnosis, being saved by just mere knowledge, was ridiculed. And who did it come from? It came from James. James said the demons believe, but they're not saved. He ridiculed gnosis, and that was where it comes from originally. But again, you're never told any of this. You're not taught any of this. You're just left in the dark to just not understand. Gnosticism is some mysterious term. It's right there in the book of James. Gnosis, the angels know that God exists, but it doesn't mean they're going to heaven. Anyway, Marcion was joined by Gnostics who had similar dualism between spirit and matter, and Docetus, who argued that Jesus wasn't human, but only seemed to be, that he was never really a part of the mess and muck that is human life, never really one of us. So this is the summary by a Presbyterian pastor in a sermon in 2021. Very accurate, my friends, very accurate. Very sad, though, that he doesn't point his finger at Paul. But let's continue. If you want to read more about Marcion, you have to kind of look it up this way. Marcion of Pontus. He was born on Pontus, which is along the Black Sea. Now I want to read you the writing of Tertullian called The Flesh of Christ. However, when Marcionism became... Now this is written about 207 AD. However, when Marcionism became powerful by 207 AD, the early church, through Tertullian's pen, battled such ideas of Marcion. Tertullian, a major church leader in North Africa, battled vigorously against the claim, insisting that, and this is the quote, Christ really became a man. So to beat and defeat Paul's views that were now percolating through this heretic, Marcion, and Paul was the only apostle, that's why he believed that Jesus didn't really have human flesh. Tertullian is saying you have committed a heresy by claiming Christ really didn't become a man, and that's his battleground. And here is the actual quote right out of Latin Christianity. But let's continue. Then he says this: as to Marcion's claim that Jesus as God could not have suffered in the flesh because his flesh was a mere phantom, Tertullian responded with alarm. Now you have to know something. Tertullian is the first one who came up with the word Trinity, but he did not believe Jesus was God. He even said Jesus did not always exist, and instead God created him, and then he was a servant within the way the pagans used to believe gods would work together. That not that Jesus was a god, but that Jesus was cooperating with the Father in doing good deeds and so on, and those type of things. But not that Jesus was God. He did not claim the Trinity meant that Jesus was God. That is something that came hundreds of years later. But he came up with the word Trinity, just so you know. But you can see here he doesn't have a belief in the Trinity, even as we're speaking here. He's going to say this: as to Marcion's claim that Jesus as God could not have suffered in the flesh because his flesh was a mere phantom, Tertullian responded with alarm. He says, have you then cut away all sufferings from Christ on the ground that as a mere phantom he was incapable of experiencing them? Tertullian, flesh of Christ. So in other words, you just said that Jesus didn't really suffer any pain or went through any agony. This was just a show, a pretense that he was putting on to make it look like he was crying, or he was under pain, or he's feeling pain and suffering. That was just a put on. That's what Marcion is saying. Jesus didn't really have human flesh. He suffered nothing. Hilary later in the 300s, he was a Trinitarian. He said that and he was a total Docetist, Marcionite type thinker, but he was a Roman Catholic leader. And Hilary said that when Christ was stabbed by the sword, it was no different than stabbing water with a sword. In other words, Jesus felt nothing. That's the Trinitarian position, ultimately, the message of Antichrist. And most clearly, Tertullian mocked Marcion by saying, quote, O thou most infamous of men, for nothing did Christ suffer from them if he really suffered nothing at all. Chapter 5 of the book I just was reading here, Flesh of Christ. So, yeah, this was a major effort to undermine and destroy Jesus by the message of Antichrist. And it just has no other basis in anything but Paul. And the person who was proposing it was a Paulinist, Marcion. And it taught that Jesus didn't really have human flesh. It just looked that way. You could stab it like you could a sword with water, and it would never cause a single pain or a feeling of sensation to Jesus because he is not truly human. That's the message of Antichrist. That's who Paul represented. And you can't change it. I can't undo it. You can't undo it. It's right there in Philippians. All right, everybody. I'm going to leave it there for now, but I'll have more on Paul in the future about his Trinitarianism, about his Christology, really what it is. He was not Trinitarian. He was neither Trinitarian nor Unitarian. He was all over the map. All right, God bless everybody. Take care. Ciao. Bye.